Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pam Sugaman, and I am Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at Ryerson University. I am delighted to welcome you to this Democracy Forum event. We're thrilled to have with us today, as you know, leader of the New Democratic Party of Canada, Jagmeet Singh, and I'd like to say before we introduce Mr. Singh, democracy and the democratic engagement of all is a priority in the Faculty of Arts. And the Democracy Forum is central to our efforts to stimulate and inspire dialogue about democracy on a national level. As many of you know, the Democracy Forum series brings together notable politicians, leaders of advocacy groups, and journalists, all in conversation about timely and pertinent issues that speak to the state of democracy today. So I'm now pleased to introduce our host and founder of the Ryerson Democracy Forum, Toronto Star columnist and visiting practitioner in the Faculty of Arts, Martin Reg-Con. Many of you will be familiar with Martin. He writes a political column for the Toronto Star with a focus on both Ontario politics and international affairs. And for 11 years, he served as foreign correspondent, holding the positions of Chief of the Middle East and Asia bureaus. In addition to his role at Ryerson, Martin is a senior fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. So I'll now ask you to step on the virtual podium, Martin, and Martin will deliver a land acknowledgement and introduce our guest for today.
Thanks, Dr. Sugaman. Welcome to the Ryerson Democracy Forum, where we ask how to do democracy differently, how to get people engaged, how to keep voters involved, how to keep the faith. A special welcome if you're joining us on television, and thank you to CPAC for broadcasting our events. Our guest today is Canada's New Democratic Party leader, Jagmeet Singh. But before I formally introduce him, let's acknowledge the land that Ryerson University is on. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory, which refers to a treaty among the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Over time, Indigenous nations and all newcomers have been invited into this territory in the spirit of peace and respect. Now let me tell you a little bit about our guest. I first met Jagmeet Singh before he became the famous Jagmeet Singh, and that was about a decade ago. We had both just arrived at the Ontario legislature, me as a political columnist and him as a political novice. And we like to joke that our Toronto Star Bureau discovered him because we called him one of the rookies worth watching. We put that in print. And then we watched him take off. He became the deputy leader of the Ontario NDP, and then he leapfrogged to the federal party to become leader in a landslide in 2017. Now, before politics, he was a criminal defense lawyer, a graduate of Osgoode Hall Law School, and a human rights activist. But he's also a martial arts expert, which is probably good training for political jujitsu and using your opponent's momentum against him. I think his real claim to fame is that he really gets around Canada. He's born in Scarborough, he moved to St. John's, Newfoundland, he was raised in Windsor, he worked in Brampton, he represented Brampton in the legislature, and now he's the MP for Burnaby South in British Columbia. So quite apart from your biography, Mr. Singh, your geography makes you very much an all-Canadian leader. So welcome, Mr. Singh, to our Ryerson Democracy Forum.
Thanks so much for having me. And it's true, Martin and I go way back, and it's a great honor to be able to share the stage with you today. Thank you to the deans, both of the school and specifically of the arts program, for the opportunity, and I'm honored to be here.
Okay, I'm ready for jujitsu. So when I see your momentum, I'm going to just duck and let you take the fall. So I'm going to kick off the questions, but my first ask is for our audience. Now's the time to start thinking up your own questions for our guest. You can send them via the chat function on Zoom, and Ryerson's Melissa Wong is waiting to hear from you. So just give us your full name if you want, so that I can give you a shout out, and I'll read out the questions on your behalf, and I will force Mr. Singh to answer because I know his moves. I'm going to try to mix it up with my own questions. Some of them are good, just so you know, some of them are going to be on policy. I'm talking to the audience so that you don't get restless if it's, it's not just going to be policy, because this is not a news conference, it's a democracy forum. So I'm also interested in personalities, not the horse races as much as just how Mr. Singh as a leader, as a politician, tries to do democracy in his own way. So I'm trying to understand his thinking and not just his statements. But let's start with the news. I'm a journalist. There was a federal budget on Monday, Mr. Singh. You say you don't much like the budget. So tell us briefly, top level, high level, what's wrong with it? And then tell us why you're going to support it.
Okay. Well, I would say that there's some things that I certainly like about it, and there's certain things that I don't like about it. The biggest thing, I think, top level why I didn't like it is one of the things we had said, which was very clear, and the Toronto Star covered this really extensively, is that the pandemic has not impacted everyone the same way. We're not all at all in the same boat. We're in the same storm, but some of us are in luxury yachts and some of us in pretty leaky lifeboats. And so we said that folks in luxury yachts, the ultra rich who are profiting off this pandemic, should be the ones who pay the price of the recovery. They should pay their fair share. So there's no real measures to get at that ultra wealth or pandemic profiteering or closing the loopholes in a real significant way of offshore tax havens, or making sure that the web giants really and truly pay their fair share. So that's a big piece, because by not answering that, the burden will fall onto people. Some of the things that we liked the fact that there's childcare. But the thing is, and what I'm really worried about is, while childcare is so vitally important, women lost their jobs, women are stretched thin, they got to care for their kids, they also got to care for aging loved ones, and they can't find affordable childcare. The Liberals have promised childcare so many times and have broken that promise. And most recently, they campaigned on pharmacare. They put it in a throne speech, put it in their campaign, and now have completely walked away from it. So to me, it drives a lot of that cynicism. I'm worried that they're not going to do it. But the shining light is, if they want to get it done, we're ready. We can pass the federal minimum wage that that we campaigned on before, that they were saying they're going to do. Let's pass it. If they want to bring in childcare, let's do it.
Okay, that's interesting. So let's pivot for a second to the politics, and then let's come back and go down in the weeds a little bit about some of the issues you mentioned. Childcare and pharmacare in particular are interesting to me, and I think a lot of Canadians. According to the opinion polls, I'm just going to reference them briefly. You are actually, not to flatter you, the most popular federal leader right now, but not the most winnable. Those same polls show that you are consistently in third place, and you're the fourth party in the House of Commons behind the Bloc Québécois. The good news for you, I guess, is that you're in a minority parliament, which means that you actually haven't won power, but you wield the balance of power. But what's that worth to you if you can't really use that power to get concessions in this budget, or did you do that?
Really appreciate the question. What we found is, throughout this pandemic, we negotiated and fought and won really big victories, not in budgets or confidence motions, but in the legislation. So anytime the government wants to enact something, they're going to need to bring forward legislation. And when they bring that legislation forward, they need to work with the party to get it passed. It's at those moments that we've actually won really significant victories. We doubled the amount of CERB that Canadians received. The Liberals started at 1,000. We made it a condition of our support and fought and won doubling it. We got help for students, which students were completely missed. There was no direct financial support. We fought for that, made it a condition of support, and won that. We won that for people. We also increased the wage subsidy. The Liberals introduced it at 10%. And at 10%, it was only going to cover 10% of a worker's salary, not enough to keep people employed. We did a bunch of different things, including a really interesting allyship of the president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, as well as the president of Unifor, brought everyone together, and myself included, wrote a letter demanding 75% at least, continue to fight, and we won that victory, brought it up to 75%. And we brought in something that needs to be improved, but the first new social program in a generation, a federal paid sick leave program, that a new social safety net, I should say. And we were able to make that happen. We want to improve it, make it better, but there's a lot of things that we're able to achieve, and we're going to continue to use our position to do that.
Okay, fair ball, and asked and answered, but did you underplay your hand by telegraphing in advance that you would support the budget? Now, you had mentioned to me in February that you thought the Liberals were hankering after an election, that they were salivating for an election, and you weren't going to give it to them in this budget. That was jujitsu. How did that turn out for you?
Right. I would say a couple of things on that. One is an interesting thing that happened, in addition, a bit of the inner workings, a bit of the Ottawa bubble, but the amendments to the budget are normally not confidence votes. Amendments to budgets happen. And in this case, the Liberals call those amendments confidence votes as well, which is very rare to do that. So again, signaling that they're kind of itching for an election. But I said clearly, I've been speaking to people in Ontario. My brother is a member of provincial parliament, speaking to healthcare workers. Things are really bad. Like a lot of the people that are getting sick are the most vulnerable. We're hearing from healthcare workers that are my friends telling me that entire families are being admitted into ICU. We're at the point where doctors are having to make a call who gets a ventilator based on who's more likely to survive. That is crisis level stuff. And there's no way, when Canadians were asked this question, there's no way it would be either safe or fair to Canadians. They in fact said it would be both unsafe and unfair to have an election. I agree. I would add to that irresponsible for me to in any way trigger an election while we're in the midst of this third wave. So I'm very firmly and confidently not going to trigger an election in the midst of a third wave that is hurting so badly, not just in Ontario, but across Canada, but particularly in Ontario.
Okay. Let me come back to COVID in a minute, because that's an important issue on our minds this week in particular. I'm just going to ask a little bit more about politics, and then I want to drill down on the others. So you style yourself a progressive party. Your mandate or your mission is to push through progressive social reforms. It feels like the Liberals are crowding you out and outflanking you, going big on childcare, talking up, but not moving. I agree on pharmacare. Politically, the subtitle of this Democracy Forum was the NDP's plan to make you prime minister, from number 3 to number 1. What is your path to victory? How do you build that coalition? Tell us.
First off, is just to reiterate that I 100% want to become prime minister. And the reason is, having seen the amount of help that we were able to get to people in this pandemic, some folks have mentioned it's probably, it's unprecedented for someone in opposition to have attained the level of victories we obtained for people. And I just imagine if we were in government, how much more we could do, how much more we would make sure the ultra rich that pay their fair share, how much we would focus on making sure we make the things that people need happen.
But how do you get there is the question.
Right. How do I get there? So how do we get there? One of the things that I believe very strongly is that young people are going to make history in the next election. In this past year, they've been involved at the forefront of social justice movements. As in the past, a lot of times you look back in history, young people have led the charge for making this world a better place. But recently, we've seen incredible numbers of people coming out for Black Lives Matter protests, coming out to fight for the climate justice. And we know that young people are feeling the impacts of a rigged system. They were amongst the hardest hit by this pandemic. And they see the ultra rich continue to get richer, and they're struggling to make ends meet. They're struggling to build a future for themselves. And we provide a real path forward. And the difference between us and the Liberals, kind of concrete things, we said we got to tax the ultra rich. The Liberals voted against that. We said, here is your own report commissioned by your own doctor that says, this is the way we need to go forward. We put forward a bill to say, let's make pharmacare happen. They voted against it. We said we should get profit.
So you're referring to Dr. Eric Hoskins there, who you used to debate against in the Ontario legislature. Now you're saying you're on with it. You guys are aligned, but the federal Liberals are not.
Well, yeah. And what's surprising is we did have debates. Dr. Hoskins and I had absolute debates in Ontario. And I was curious to see what plan he would propose when it came to the pharmacare plan. Obviously, I had no input in that plan. I didn't speak to him about it. But what he proposed is exactly what New Democrats and progressives have said. It should be universal. It should be entirely public. It should be accessible to all. And the program that we absolutely believe is what's supported by the experts. It's not really a surprise, but it was, for me, really encouraging to see a really honest depiction of what we need to do. And the Liberals backed away from it, have yet to even accept the findings of that report. And then finally,
can we drill down? I'm sorry, I didn't. Go ahead, finish your thought.
Just okay. The last thing is that, one of the worst things that have happened in this pandemic is the impact of the pandemic on seniors, particularly in long-term care and particularly in for-profit. And one of the biggest, the second largest providers of long-term care services is owned by a federal agency. The union workers of that union that own it have said, we don't want to be continuing to own this. The government in the past has nationalized the pipeline. We're saying, for the sake of our seniors, let's make Rivera public and let's work towards removing all for-profit long-term care homes from our system. And this is something we could do. Again, Liberals voted against that. It's basically siding.
And you're referring to the public sector union that owns, there's a large shareholder of Rivera, yes, which runs retirement and old care homes, long-term care homes. Okay, let's talk about pharmacare, which you just mentioned. It's what I wanted to follow up on. The NDP gets credit for leading the way on Medicare decades ago, but it couldn't get its way on pharmacare. It was just too much, and you had to cut a deal. So it's the missing link. We have free Medicare, but not free medicines. And now the Liberal budget is putting all its eggs, essentially, in childcare, and we'll see where that goes. But I guess my question to you is a very political one, not partisan, but just about the nature of democracy and communication. How do you mobilize people for pharmacare? It's something I'm quite passionate about, whether it's me, Dr. Eric Hoskins, the NDP, which has consistently put it at the top. But there doesn't seem to be a hue and cry among the public, Mr. Singh. And that's what I'm going to, can I call you Jagmeet?
Yeah, just call me Jagmeet. I should have said that at the beginning. Sorry. Yes, for sure, Martin. Yes.
Like, where is the clamor from Canadians? And I worry that, much like Americans, people are actually satisfied. Most people, not everyone, that there's millions who fall through the cracks, but most unionized workers, most professional workers, and others have workplace benefit plans, and so they think they're okay. So how do you actually mobilize Canadians and create that groundswell so that politicians will act? Because pharmacare has a lot of advocates among economists and analysts and so on who see the benefits.
Yeah, it's the big question. How do we mobilize people? For sure, it's always a big thing on our minds. With pharmacare, a couple of things that I found that's been really compelling is when we put the issue into a story that impacts people. And I think about some of the students that I met. Who one of the students I met was graduating from a master's program in BC, and she said, I was healthy my whole life. I was an athlete, never had a problem, and I had adult onset type 1 diabetes, which is a type of diabetes that's just genetic. It doesn't. There's no. She was healthy. She ate well. It was not something that was brought on by poor diet. She just got it. And then all of a sudden, when she graduated, she realized she had no drug plan. And she was a master's student, graduated with a huge cost. And she thought, I never imagined that I would need medication coverage, but I do. I remember I spoke to a kid who also has a lifelong illness, and he has to deal with it. And he's healthy, precocious young kid, filled with energy and really mature beyond his years. And I said, well, what's it like for you? And he's like, oh, I don't worry about the medication. I make sure I take it on time. I know that I might die if I don't take it. And he kind of said it so casually. I was so impressed with him. And then he said, but you know what? I am worried about something. And I go, well, what are you worried about? He said, I'm worried about my mom and dad because I know it costs them a lot to pay for my medication. I looked at that and I said, like, a little kid should not be worried about that. And the reality is, when we invest in this, we know that it just makes sense. And I don't care for people to call this a progressive thing or not progressive thing. It just makes sense to do. When we've got a healthcare system where you can go into a doctor and say, hey, I'm not feeling well. They find out what's wrong with you, prescribe medication, and you can't actually afford to take it, you end up getting more sick and you will end up back in that same hospital.
Of course.
But then with the worst conditions, which cost a lot more. It just makes sense. So I believe we can appeal to people through sharing the stories of how much difference this would make and how this could make our healthcare system just take better care of each other.
Okay, I have a trick question for you. I apologize in advance.
I'm not surprised.
Because I'm serious about pharmacare. I'm serious about pharmacare. Liberals are going big on childcare, they're kind of sidelining pharmacare for the moment. Can you do both? Can you have childcare, as important as it is? I am passionate for that as well. Can you have childcare, pharmacare, NDP Dentacare, NDP canceling student loans for up to $20,000? Can you do it all?
We can. And the reason why we can, it's a matter of choices. And we kind of went through some of these choices. For example, when we talked about forgiving student debt, we looked at the cost of what that would be. And we looked at what the previous governments have done. In 1 year alone, 2017, the Liberal government forgave over $7 billion of corporate debt that they were owed. There was corporate loans, and they just forgave those loans. And in contrast, if we forgave student debt, it would lift up students and it would be less expensive than that in 1 year. So we look at the choices that governments make. We also look at the fact that it's a cost right now to our economy. It is a cost to our country that offshore state havens are still allowed. There was a recent court case just a couple of years ago where CRA took a big grocery store to court and said they are hiding their money in offshore accounts. The judge accepted the evidence, said, yes, they make their profits entirely in Canada. Yes, it looks like they took all that profit and put it into a bank in the Caribbean. And yes, they did that solely for the purpose of hiding their money. But it's actually completely legal for them to do that, so there's no penalty. That's what we're up against. We are making it, well, I am not. Liberals and conservatives have made a choice to cost us money by allowing tax havens, by allowing web giants to make profits off Canadians but not pay taxes here, by allowing the ultra rich to not pay their fair share. And that is a choice. I would not make that choice. Instead, I would choose to invest in people, increase that revenue, and make the right choices that help people out.
Okay, let me get a little chunky for a moment because we're on a university campus. You want to do all these caring things. So by which I mean long-term care, pharmacare, dentacare, childcare. But you can't do it yourself. Even if you do what you say you're going to do and win the next election and become prime minister, you still have to get the provinces to play ball. especially on long-term care, especially on childcare, on all of them, pharmacare. Ontario says it won't do it. How do you do that?
This is where we have to respect the beauty and the challenges of a federalist country. I think it's incredible that we give a lot of that the Constitution and the Charter is designed in such a way that respects the differences of different parts of our country, different regions and territories and provinces. That's something that's special and gives a lot of autonomy and voice to people. But we know some of the most incredible things that we've done have happened with federal leadership. Healthcare was the same thing. Not all provinces wanted to sign on. It took a while. And I believe you just got to get started. And getting started means that we know that there's Atlantic provinces who've signaled interest. The Yukon previously signaled interest in moving forward. We start somewhere, just as we did with universal healthcare. We start somewhere and show the benefits, talk about how the people in those provinces and territories are better off, and then start to apply pressure and say, we can make this happen in other provinces. It took years. It wasn't like we made universal healthcare happen in 1 year. It took a long time. It was a battle. And so similarly, it's a battle that I'm willing to fight and I believe in, and it will take time and it will mean negotiating, but it's worth doing.
But it's taken 60 years for pharmacare, and that's not your fault. It's our fault, and maybe that's the jujitsu we were talking about earlier. But I do have one other trick question for you. If you had stayed in Ontario, maybe you'd be premier by now or in position to be premier instead of Doug Ford. And Doug Ford is the premier who dismantled the beginnings of pharmacare in Ontario and is causing you some grief on climate change and other things. So we talked about this. Admittedly, it was off the record. It's one of those rare things where you said, hey, come say hi. And you know, you are a chatty guy, and we agreed it was off the record. So I can't quote you and you can't quote me, but I can quote myself. And I said to you at the time, maybe you could get more done in Ontario. So tell me again why I was wrong. I mean, you could have tackled pharmacare, and instead you left for Ottawa. You abandoned us. Wouldn't it be nice to have you potentially as a premier of Ontario saying yes on pharmacare, yes on childcare?
I'm a big believer that Andrea Horwath will be the next premier of Ontario, and she's shown willingness to fight for the things that matter most. And at the federal level, there was no leader. There was a leadership race, and a lot of folks are encouraging me that maybe we could engage a lot of people that hadn't been engaged before. Maybe we can inspire some young people. Maybe it would make a big difference to see someone that didn't fit the mold of what you imagine when you think of a national leader. Being a leader, maybe it will inspire people across the country to get more engaged in democracy in their communities. And so looking at the opportunity to make a difference nationally, I was encouraged by lots of great folks, and I finally made the decision. But if I was in Ontario, I would still be a loyal supporter of our leader and would be working towards forming a government in Ontario.
Okay, you walked right into my trap. So my next question is, how could you abandon Brampton? I mean, Brampton was your big breakthrough. Why not come home? You ran in a by-election, but why not come home in the last federal election to Brampton instead of commuting all the way to Burnaby in British Columbia all the time?
Well, this is a very fair question because I love Brampton. I got a lot of wonderful experiences, and I fought hard for the people, and I still fight for Brampton and fight for people across the country. I lived in Newfoundland, and it's got a soft spot for me. I've lived in London, Ontario, when I went to university. So really, Canada has become home to me. So I am a national leader that believes in supporting all of Canada and fighting for all of Canada. There was, again, a lot of folks encouraged me. I feel like as a leader, you got to listen to people around you. And sometimes you got to take a firm position and say no. And sometimes you got to listen to good advice. And so lots of people really thought it would be a good idea at the time for me to have a seat. And to me, I got to say, it's an incredible honor that I have now been able to say I lived in 3 really unique parts of the country, and I've represented 3 different regions. And I can really speak with the voice of a lot of experiences that Canadians have. So it's been an honor and a privilege, and I'm really thankful that the good people of Burnaby elected me, as well as the great people of Burnaby, of Brampton and Malton and Mississauga, I guess. And I'm going to continue to fight for everybody.
Okay, no more trick questions. Let's get serious about COVID for a minute. Your counterpart in Ontario, Andrea Horwath, has criticized Doug Ford, I think justifiably, on a lot of the chaos that we're seeing right now. But Ontario is not the only a jurisdiction that is suffering greatly with COVID. And why is Ottawa getting off so lightly for such lousy quarantines? I mean, you have criticized the government, but it's not there. Justin Trudeau seems to be the Teflon prime minister on COVID-19. Why is that?
I couldn't answer that question because I agree with you. Like we have as a country done a really poor job with quarantining, and it is directly the federal responsibility. So Justin Trudeau has on this, and I never say these things with any pleasure. Like I want things to work. I want us to be able to beat this thing. So I say this with reticence, or I'm sad to say this, but yeah, like it's factual that Justin Trudeau has failed when it comes to the quarantining. The other big thing is that while Ford has for a long time, maybe today seems like he's backtracking, but for a long time didn't want to improve the paid sick leave. We fought for a paid sick leave at the federal level. And it's clear the experts have said it's just not good enough. It needs to be more flexible. It needs to be a bit more money. It needs to be easier to get. We've been saying, let's do that. It's going to save lives. So again, on these two fronts, Justin Trudeau has kind of I've done my job and kind of stepped back. And I don't believe you can do that when the country's on fire, when one of the most populated provinces and regions and cities is on fire. You can't sit back and say, oh, I've already done my job. You've got to jump in with the hose and start helping in any way we can.
So I've been asking for over a year and a half about why Doug Ford canceled sick leave, and nobody said boo. Now people wanted to restore it and go further. And he, at the last minute, may have a sort of deathbed reprieve on sick pay. but why doesn't Ottawa do more? And here's a question for you. Unifor, I'm a member of Unifor, a conflict of interest here, my union. I think I introduced you to Jerry Dias years ago. Do you remember that?
Yes,
and he said, "Where are you being? Like, why is it taking so long?" But anyway, I'm sure
now we chat regularly.
There you go. I'm taking credit for that. But the fact is that the new Democratic Party Premier of British Columbia, Mr. Horgan, has been dragging his heels on a paid sick leave. Should he be doing better and leading the way so that Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau can follow?
Well, what Premier Horgan has done is brought in vaccination leave, which is one of the things. I just got vaccinated yesterday, I should say, which is. I
was going to ask you that. Good.
Yeah, I was really honored. I'm feeling it a bit today. Like it's a bit rough. I mean, I'm okay. I'm healthy, but it does make you feel sore. I'm feeling a bit like an old man. I guess I'm kind of getting up there anyways, but a little bit of soreness, a little bit of aches and pains. But it would be amazing to be able to take time off. I had a lot of important events that I had to do, so I'm doing them. Yeah. But for a lot of people, they need time off. So he's put that in place. And at the federal level was one of the folks that worked with me to fight to bring it in at the federal level in the first place. Really, Justin Trudeau has this. It should be improved. In Ontario, things are at crisis level. And that's why Doug Ford has got to step in. So I'm saying both of them have to really step up. Things are really bad right now in Ontario.
Okay, but no more martial arts. I think I'm hearing from you. Actually, I'm not. But should I be hearing from you that John Horgan should do the right thing on sick pay?
Well, I think he's taken a really bold step on vaccination leave, and so that's essentially a part of the solution. And we're going to continue to ramp up pressure to get Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to improve paid sick leave access. I've called for the Emergency Act to be deployed and to use that to get payments to workers directly and get the vaccine to people who need it most. And with how bad things are in Ontario, I think that's why people are calling for Doug Ford to do something. It is the worst of anywhere else in the country, and that's why the situation is so dire.
Okay, I'm going to come back when there's a bit of a pause with a couple more questions, but I want to share. We've got a few questions that are coming in now, and I'd encourage people to send more in. But here's a question from, and forgive me on pronunciations. I haven't gotten the clues here, but I believe it's Joselle Angelica Gerardo, who is president of the Faculty of Arts Student Society, the Ryerson Liberal Arts Society. The question begins with an invocation: Happy Earth Day. What should Canada do to prevent the advancement of climate change?
We've got to fight the climate crisis like we really mean to win the fight. That's really what it comes down to. It can't just be any more symbolic gestures. Today is Earth Day, and Justin Trudeau announced the plan. And the plan is sadly the worst of all of the G7 countries when it comes to emissions. Since becoming leader, emissions have gone down or gone up under Prime Minister Trudeau's government. And it's the only G7 country in the world where emissions have actually gone up while he's been in power. All the other ones have gone down. So we've got to set better targets. We've got to meet them. We've got to be accountable. And we've got to realize that like the impacts of climate crisis are not a distant future idea. It is right now. I was in BC when the forest fires were so thick that the air was unbreathable. People were warned that don't go outside, and it stung the eyes and you couldn't breathe in. I met a mom who told me she's worried about the climate crisis, and she had a daughter, a young girl in her arms, and said, I'm like, oh, of course you're worried about your daughter's future. She's like, no, I'm worried about next summer. Next summer, we were unable to breathe. Last summer, we were unable to breathe the air. And I'm worried about my little daughter not being able to grow up with being able to breathe air. Like, it's that real. So we've got to fight it like we want to win it. And it means ending a couple of things, ending the fossil fuel subsidies that the government continues to do, stop exempting the biggest polluters, which are currently exempted. And it means really fighting this crisis seriously like we want to win it.
Okay. Here's a question from Tiana Maharaj. Hi, Jagmeet.
Hi.
The 2019 NDP slate was very diverse, but the candidates were still disproportionately white men. How will you increase the diversity of candidates and the political participation of marginalized communities in the next election?
Really important question. All these questions are important. Yours are too, Martin, but this is something that I really think about a lot. While we actually had the record most diversity in our candidates compared to other parties and in all seats across Canada, but we've got to do better. And I think a part of the reason is something we don't really reflect on is that a lot of spaces of power are not welcoming to people who don't look like who's been there before. And so we've got to really acknowledge that those spaces are just not inclusive to women, to people from diverse backgrounds, racialized people, people living with disabilities, Indigenous people. So I've been making it a commitment of mine to continue to fight to make sure we've got candidates that represent and reflect what Canada is, but also to try to make sure that we've got good candidates in winnable seats. So it's been a part of my leadership priority. My team knows, and we've been improving it, and it's been significantly better than other parties. But of course, we need to do more.
Okay, here's a good segue. It's a question from Kathy Crow, who is, like me, a visiting practitioner at Ryerson.
The Kathy Crow, the street nurse?
The street nurse. You took the words out of my mouth. Yep, almost as famous as you are. Here's your question. In 2019, you won your seat in a BC by-election where the Green Party, as a courtesy to you, chose to stand down and not run a candidate against you so that you could win your seat in the House of Commons. This showed a level of political respect that we don't often see. Ryerson is in Toronto Centre, the riding of Toronto Centre, where the Green leader, Annamie Paul, who, by the way, is coming in a couple of weeks. You can watch. I'll send you the link to our Ryerson Democracy Forum. So Annamie Paul is running to obtain a seat. Will you offer the same collegial gesture to her? That's Kathy's question. Just some background for our listeners, and Jagmeet knows this, but Kathy Crow has run for the NDP. So this is not some planted Tory question. She's run for the NDP. In fact, she's been asked she's told me, to run, to seek the nomination for the party. And she actually turned it down because she wants to bring more diversity, color, and thought into the House of Commons. So interesting question, because the Greens did, in fact, not run a candidate. And Annamie Paul went from 4th place to 2nd place in the last by-election here. So if the NDP had done that courtesy, chances are that the Greens would have won instead of the Liberals. This was in the finance minister's old riding, Mr. Morneau. And so the question is, are the progressives going to fight each other again and let the Liberals through again, although the Liberals would call themselves progressives too? Mr. Singh.
Well, one of the things that we kind of spoke to people about this, and the feedback I got from a lot of people was they don't want parties making backroom deals about who runs and who doesn't run. People want to be able to make the decision. And I think it is way too inside bubble to be like, okay, we're not going to run someone here and we're going to extend. And people are like, well, I have the right to choose who I want to vote for. And I really believe in that. I think that once elected, we need to work together. And if there's anyone who wants to work towards making sure we do the things necessary, pharmacare, childcare, fighting the climate crisis, like we really want to win, creating good jobs, creating a sustainable and long-lasting economy, then I'm there for it. But when it comes to elections, I don't believe that it's my place to make a backroom deal that takes away a choice from people. People should make their choice freely.
Okay, you walked into one of my own follow-up questions that I've been thinking about. So maybe I'm getting mental jujitsu from you, but you know, in a perfect world, in the perfect NDP world of PR, proportional representation, you would likely be in a coalition with the Greens, and you would be working together with Annamie Paul to make yourself prime minister, let's say. Question is, could that really work? There is so much bad blood between the NDP and the Greens. In the last election, you guys were kind of shouting each other, you and Elizabeth May, and you're a pretty collegial guy, but there's a lot of institutional tension and rivalry. And we saw that again in, you want to represent BC, I'm going to have to throw BC at you again, not just on sick pay, which you didn't answer, but on, they had a deal. They had a deal that there was not going to be an early election, and in exchange for Green support to make John Horgan Prime Minister, John Horgan saw an opening in the middle of a pandemic, something you may not like. He had an election. So why should we think that Greens and you Democrats with shared ideas and ideals could actually work together?
Once elected, I think we just fundamentally have to. A couple things that, like, I don't have any concern about the Green Party or their institution or any of their leaders or members. I've got no concern. My focus is all on who's in power now, who's making decisions right now, and my target is squarely the Liberal government and Justin Trudeau, and getting the help that people need. So that's one really key thing. In BC, there's a couple of things. There was an agreement with a leader that resigned, and not just resigned his position as leader, but also resigned his seat. So there was no longer a seat in Parliament, which opened up a lot of insecurity, instability at a time when they needed stability. And they were only, I think they were about 3.5 years into this mandate. So it was just about 6 months early. So not like a year into the election. And the agreement was broken because the person who signed it, the leader who signed it, was resigned and no longer leader. So different scenarios. But I just think that when it comes down to it, if anyone is willing to work towards building a better country where we lift people up, we make the ultra rich pay their fair share, we invest in a good economy that works and creates long lasting jobs and helps us reduce emissions, we invest in healthcare that's there for people when they need it, I'm down to work with anyone to do that. That to me is my goal, is to get it done. And whoever is in agreement or wants to make that happen, welcome to work together to make that happen.
Okay, can I just jump in with a friendlier follow-up, if I can call it that? One of the things that struck me when you arrived at Queen's Park at the legislature was that you really did try to break through the silos between parties, and it really was like a bit of a blood sport. And you'd call other members your brother, you'd call journalists your brother. We can't be your brothers, much as we'd like to be, but it's not our role. But and I remember another politician saying, "Well, I'm not your brother. I'm a liberal." And so, but my question is, you've always tried to use a kind of a personal bond to break through. How's that working federally? You just mentioned that you have no grudges against the Greens. What's your relationship like? Just, I don't mean this to be a People magazine question, but I am interested in relationships and rivalries, because a journalist has to talk to people from every party. And then I'm always amazed when people from other parties hate each other, even though I can triangulate. So how do you get along with Annamie Paul? How do you get along with Erin O'Toole, the Tory leader? How do you get along with Justin Trudeau? Okay, you're distracted by your party interests, but you had a private chat with him when he was immersed in the blackface controversy, as I recall. You spoke to him in the last several months over election and budget preparations. Just tell us how that personal dynamic works.
Yeah, I think so. For me, nothing's personal. I try to fight for things because I know that it's important for people, and I'm offended at the injustice. I'm angry at the injustice and angry at the bad decision, but I try not to make it personal. People have their own motives and their own reason why they're doing things. So I still channel the frustration that people feel, and I still fight passionately, but I try to use as much compassion and connection that I can. And that's kind of a motto for me. Love and courage that folks have mentioned before is really the way I live my life. I think you've got to have love in your heart and the courage to do something about it. And that's a powerful force when you can use it towards making the world a better place. So that's what I do. I got, high-bye relationships with everybody. I'm cool with everybody. I got no personal qualms. I got qualms about bad positions. Like when Trudeau says that he cares about systemic racism, takes a knee, but has yet to do anything to stop systemic racism in the RCMP, put in place a ban on carding or racial profiling, bring in some concrete changes to the use of force, make sure there's a de-escalation focus, shift resources away from policing towards mental health and healthcare responses. That to me offends me. I'm angry at that, but I try not to make it personal. I make it about the issue.
Okay, but just give us a little flavor of the relationship. Do you have, is there a cordiality? Is it tense? I mean, I'm aware more about some of the relationships at Queen's Park, which are very tense between the party leaders, sometimes, some of them, and have been. Do you have a kind of a shared professional relationship, or is it just all business? I have no idea. Tell us.
I'm cordial with everybody. I can have a good chat with everybody, even if we disagree. There's things you can chat about that don't involve those things. So yeah, I'm on a okay level with all the leaders. I don't have any sort of grudges. I have grudges about positions and grudges about the impact on people, but on a personal level, everyone's pretty nice. They got into politics, I guess, because they care about people, and so they're able to have nice conversations. So it's yeah, it's fine. It's collegial. I don't have like a deep friendship though. It's not like sometimes we heard in the past that different party leaders would go hang out regularly and be kind of tight friends. We don't have that type of relationship, but professional and
and
cordial.
I wasn't thinking of that. I was thinking of Stephen Lewis, a former Ontario NDP leader, and Bill Davis, who actually had a kind of a grudging respect and personal relationship, or Bob Ray and some of the other and Bill Davis also. Maybe it's all about Bill Davis. I don't know. Question from Maria Guardado, which I think is a great question. Like you, they're all great, but this is one that's dear to my heart because of what we do at the Ryerson Democracy Forum. And Maria asks, how do you suggest young people mobilize in an efficient way to get political actors, that's you, to follow through on policy implementation? And do you think young people are often dismissed? And I'll add the word patronized.
I think people have often counted out young people, but I think that is to their folly. Young people, like I said, are going to make history in the next election and future elections. Young people are amongst the most disenfranchised. They're frustrated, but they're also very optimistic. And that is a very powerful mix. When you've got someone who's frustrated, but can still be hopeful and optimistic about making things better, that to me is an incredible blend that will make big differences happen. So I believe in that. And I think young people have been taken for granted in the past. We saw a number of examples where I look at Justin Trudeau was able to capture a lot of energy of young people and then turned around and didn't deliver on a lot of things that people cared about. Promised to clean drinking water for Indigenous people and broke that promise, admitted that he broke it. Promised to bring in electoral reform that a lot of young people thought would be good for our electoral system, give people more say and more voice and have their vote count, broke that promise. So that cynicism is certainly that it discourages people to vote. And I'm hoping that we tap into the optimism and the hopefulness, and we lay out real, clear, practical and concrete and bold things that we can do to make people's lives better. And we've been trying to do that throughout this pandemic, show that here's something, we want to make sure we've got a society that lifts everyone up. Here's a real thing that we can do to make people's lives better right now. Double the CERB, get help out to students, make sure the wage subsidy is higher, bring in a federal paid sick leave. So we've been able to bridge that gap between the ideas and values and do something real in someone's life. And I think that's a part of it. We got to listen to young people. They're talking about the isolation and the mental health pressures of this pandemic, and we've got to respond to that. So we've got a plan to include mental health into our healthcare system as well. So there's lots that we can do, and we just have to have an honest and open and a relationship based on convictions of getting things done.
I got a great question teed up here on mental health. Before I do, I had a mental lapse. I forgot one follow-up I wanted to ask while we were talking about the leaders, and you didn't give any juicy details. So forget the personalities. Let's talk about the politics for just a minute about Erin O'Toole, whose name I did mention, leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. You said something interesting recently, and I want you to expand on that for us, please, when we talked in February, and that is that you would not support a conservative government. You would not, if you had the balance of power going down the road, you would not crown Erin O'Toole Prime Minister. Tell us why. Because in the past, Jack Layton essentially made Stephen Harper Prime Minister for several years. So why not now?
Well, looking at what Erin O'Toole offers and looking at the track record of Stephen Harper, which is really good evidence, what Erin O'Toole was a part of as a cabinet minister under Harper is a lot of those cuts to people, the cuts to the help that people needed, made it harder to join a union. Everything that we're against is what they've really kind of fought for. And it's not a surprise. Conservatives often try to slip in something nice before an election, but their real agenda is not really ever a secret. They believe in smaller governments, less help to people, cutting the supports to people, and it means that people end up suffering. And so that is not what I believe in. I think Justin Trudeau and the Liberals present another problem. They say the right things, which is encouraging, but they don't actually do them. I guess the fact that they at least say some of the things gives us more potential to be able to work on projects together. Both of them, I think, have serious problems, and that's why I'm encouraging folks, let's not just deal with this red and blue revolving door. There's an orange one right here that's ready. I'm wearing a blue turban today, but an orange one that's ready to make these things actually happen. And that's my goal.
Okay. So here's the question from Maha Jawas that's top of mind. Hello, I'm a volunteer at Future Majority, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that mobilizes youth and civic engagement. And one of our campaigns right now is about universal mental health care. And you had just mentioned mental health, specifically getting a royal commission on universal mental health care. We're discussing pharmacare, forgiving student debt, et cetera, but is universal mental health care something that can be possible in Canada as well?
Yes, absolutely it can. And a couple of reasons why, in terms of the healthcare spending, this is really vital. One is we know that a year of lockdowns and isolation has had an impact on people's mental health, and it has disproportionately impacted young people. We can just imagine why. If you're someone later on in your career, you've got a family, maybe children, an established career, the impact of the pandemic meant maybe you worked at home, but you didn't have that same isolation, your career was still able to continue. For a young person trying to find a partner, trying to start a career, trying to connect with friends, it has been incredibly difficult. So young people have felt the impact harder, and specifically their mental health has been hit harder. On top of that, there's more and more evidence coming out that COVID infections have been linked to long-term impacts, and one of those long-term impacts are impacts on people's mental health. And I don't know the exact causality. It could just be because it's such a scary thing and it has a lot of impact on people. But we know that this is going to be another serious crisis, a mental health crisis coming out of this pandemic. So we've got to be ready for it. And this is just a prudent and smart and just thing to do to make sure we've got mental health supports for people coming out of one of the worst crises that we faced in recent memory.
Great question, and thanks for that answer. And if I can be a little lighthearted about a serious subject, your staff are also good at jujitsu, and they tried to trick me into giving them the questions in advance. They're just doing their job, and but I didn't fall for it. But I did give them a heads up that we're going to talk about the budget. Obviously, that's something this week. But I often will tell our guests, Premier Ford, others, that something that comes up often on any campus in Canada now, anytime I've been covering politicians, is mental health. But you knew that because you've been to Ryerson and you're on campus a lot. Here's a question that I did not write. This comes from Jackie Gingras, who is a faculty member at Ryerson. I did not write this, so when I say this, these are not my words. Quote, I am a big supporter of the NDP federally. However, provincially, John Horgan continues to log old growth support site C, which contravenes UNDRIP and has botched proportional representation, and Rachel Notley's support of oil and gas extraction. How do you square what appears to me to be policies that contravene our federal values? Unquote. By the way, in our secret off the record conversation, don't worry, I won't give anything away. I did say to you, that's an interesting party. It's an interesting family you're trying to bring together federally, BC, Alberta, Ontario, etc. I find it fascinating though, and I'll just say for my quick preamble and then giving you time to think, that I think at a Geographic Forum, the challenge for a politician is to try to be a big tent party and bring all these, bring the family together. I'm not trying to answer for you, but that's a really good question. How do you reconcile that?
There are differences that are regional. There's no question about it, but there is actually so much more that ties us together. We look at Premier Notley and her track record, increasing minimum wage, more supports for workers, lowered the cost of tuition, supported people in a really distinct and concrete way, made their lives better, investments in healthcare. And we see the alternative. Kenny came in, slashed those programs, slashed that help, and made things a lot worse for people. Premier Notley at the time, Rachel Notley, also tried to diversify the economy and really believe that we need to build an economy that is diverse and is of the future. And Premier Horgan, the work that he's done in just one mandate in the minority, in terms of immediately putting in a project to give people access to childcare, which has transformed lives, one of the best and boldest pilot projects around childcare that we've seen in this country, probably second to Quebec. He brought in immediate impacts to help people with housing, brought in supports for workers. And so really at the end of the day, there's going to be some differences. I believe we need to build an economy that is sustainable, and that's going to mean some challenges. But what unites us is that we all believe that workers should never be left behind. So we got to find a way to make sure workers in any sector, resource sector, logging sector, that these workers have a bright opportunity for a future to build a life for themselves and their family. and we've got to find a way to do that, respecting the challenges across the country. But there is so much more in common. BC, I think, also has one of the boldest climate plans of all North America. It's one of the most ambitious. So they've got a lot of good things, and there's obviously always going to be some fair criticism people are going to bring up about different positions different parties take and different provinces take. But there's so much more that we have in common that unites us and connects us, that the differences don't stand in the way of us moving forward.
Jack Layton opposed that British Columbia climate plan at the time, a carbon tax, when the NDP was in its anti-tax phase, but that's ancient history. Question, let me just follow up for just a half second without relitigating your answer, because I am fascinated again for this democracy forum about the role of big tent parties. I mean, going back to Ed Broadbent, it's been a challenge when the Green and Environment, it was then called the environmental movement, now Green. How do you, when you are so focused on, as we are, on tapping into the idealism and motivation of younger people and all Canadians on, let's say, the environment about which people are passionate, it's hard to be on side with that if you are also trying to reconcile union interests and other economic interests and regional interests. So aren't you going to continue to bleed passionate environmental supporters if you're trying to be all things to all progressives?
Well, I think there's a really interesting part on many parts of your question, but one part in particular is that when we look at big tent parties, some parties are really aligned around a brand instead of a clear set of values, and they kind of move and adjust and kind of are anything to anybody. New Democrats are different because we've got some clear values that we don't want to compromise and that we are firm on, but there's still unifying things. Like everyone in this country, no matter what the realities of their province, believes that we need an economy that works for not just the next couple of years, but the next couple of decades. And everyone knows that global markets are moving towards more and more sustainable economies, renewable energy. It is the future, and we all need to get there. So there's a lot of things that bring us together. I think that never forgetting about workers is a unifying thing. We can't just try to talk about the environment from an ivory tower, not realizing people on the ground who've got jobs, who've got lives. And I think that's what makes us a real party that can connect with people, because we talk about workers and their struggles. And we can't solve the climate crisis unless we bring people along. And bringing people along means acknowledging that we've got a country that has a lot of resource sector workers. What do we do to support those workers into long-lasting jobs that build a good future for them and their families? That's a challenge, but I think it's one I'm ready for. I'm ready for that challenge, but I think it's a unifying challenge because it's about how we leave no one behind.
Okay. Here's a segue that talks about jobs in a post-COVID economy. Hello, my name is Kristen Rowe. I'm a second-year media student. My job was closed due to COVID, and I really appreciate CERB as it has supported me throughout the pandemic. Post-pandemic, what supports do you think the government should provide to help recent grads and students who are struggling to gain employment due to how businesses have scaled down during the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really, really good question because it talks directly about what young people are going through. For many reasons, before the pandemic, this generation of young people are the first generation ever to have less opportunities than the previous generation. Previous generation was able to get a job out of high school or college, earned enough to be able to buy a home and support their kids through school. That dream is no longer a reality for people now. And that's something that is a challenge. On top of that, the pandemic has meant a lot of the entry-level jobs, the jobs that young people would first take, are not there. So a couple of things that we want to do. One is we think forever, permanently, we need to remove interest off of the federal loans that students have. That should never be a thing. No student should have to worry about interest compiling on their loan. So we want to permanently remove that. And then we also want to go beyond that. And we're the first party to propose actual debt forgiveness. We need to forgive student debt. And that's going to help students that are just struggling out of university or college and got a lot of debt and maybe make a bad decision around a job because they just need to get employment right away or can't find a job. The other thing is we want to put in place a 5-year break so students don't have to worry about finding the first job possible, that they won't have to pay back their loans, no interest accruing, no jeopardy. They can wait 5 years before getting started. Those are some of the things we're proposing that are real ways to acknowledge the struggles that students face.
Okay, question from Steve Richter. Bonjour, Monsieur Singh. Je me permets de vous poser ma question en français. Étant un fier supporter du parti que vous dirigez, je suis très intéressé à me renseigner un peu plus sur votre vision pour faire étendre l'orange de parti dans les régions à l'extérieur de nos centres traditionnels, Vancouver, Toronto, Hamilton.
OK. Merci infiniment pour la question. Ça me donne une occasion de parler en français, la belle langue Molière. C'est essentiel qu'on fait exactement ce que vous avez proposé. Donc, merci pour la question. Je veux inspirer les gens à travers le pays parce que je veux devenir Premier ministre pour tout le Canada. Ça veut dire toutes les régions. Donc, ce qu'on va essayer de faire, c'est de connecter avec les gens, les jeunes en particulier, déjà compris qu'il y a un système maintenant qui ne fonctionne pas pour monsieur, madame, tout le monde, qui fonctionne pour les autres riches. Donc, on va proposer des solutions qui aident à livrer l'aide à tout le monde et à inspirer les gens de penser, de oser. Comment on peut créer un meilleur avenir? Comment on peut bâtir pour mieux, pour vrai? Donc, avec cette motivation, cette inspiration, on va proposer des solutions comme de taxer les autres riches, d'investir dans notre système de santé. Pour les régions, on va proposer quelques mesures spécifiques pour rendre l'accès au Internet et les services cellulaires plus facile et moins cher. Donc, on a plusieurs idées pour aider tout le monde et j'espère qu'on peut les convaincre pour la prochaine élection. Mais la bataille continue, c'est une bataille importante et on va toujours être là pour se battre pour les gens.
Okay, we're almost out of time. We have room for just a couple more questions. I want to just quickly jump in with couple of human rights questions that I wanted to ask you. One of being one of your passions, it's I think one of your secret reasons for abandoning us in Ontario and leapfrogging to Ottawa.
I didn't abandon anybody. I still fight for Ontario all the time.
Just poking you. Okay, so there's a political pilgrimage that Canadian politicians make to India, to the Golden Temple in Amritsar. It's the holiest religious site for religious Sikhs. I've covered on the ground a couple of prime ministers in India doing that trip, circumambulating. They could, but you can't because you were refused a visa for India in 2013. Same thing happened to Bob Ray in Sri Lanka. We had Mr. Ray here a few months ago at the Ryerson Democracy Forum, and he wasn't allowed in. What would it take to change the mind of the Indian government? Do you have to become PM to get the visa, and where's that at?
Well, the last I know, it was the one-time refusal in 2013. I haven't applied yet, so I don't know the status. But at the time, I was very vocal about the mistreatment of people in India, women, people based on their caste that are continuing to face injustice, people based on their religion. And my critique was of specifically the government that's been involved in that. And Modi has definitely continued that same tradition of dividing people, of shutting down discourse, of arresting peaceful protesters, as well as journalists who've been systemically arrested, professors have been arrested, and really flaming this divisive flame about sectarian violence. He was someone that was involved in the riot that killed many Muslims, and he was banned himself from traveling to different countries. He is a part of a party that promotes that type of hate and division. So I don't imagine that someone that I've been very critical of, who is very averse to people raising justice and human rights and speaking about these things, would want me to visit. I believe we still have to have dialogue, even with people we disagree with, even with people that do horrible things. Not speaking to someone at a political level, at an international level, doesn't help us move forward. We have to have dialogue. We've got to talk about the human rights violations and talk about how people deserve better. And so I'm always going to try to work towards diplomacy, having engagement, speaking with people, but be unafraid and unequivocal about criticizing countries' track record when it comes to human rights, even if it means I don't get to travel there.
Okay, maybe you do have to become PM. A couple of really quick questions as the clock runs out on us. One of the complaints that Bob Ray had about the NDP when he left it was its stance on Israel. Controversial resolution just this month at your policy convention that would block, among other things, block arms sales to Israel. What if Israel's in a war? Still wouldn't resupply them?
So the motion or the resolution came from an acknowledgement that there are very grave human rights violations happening against Palestinians, and it's important to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge that Palestinians have the right to live with peace and security. I also am fiercely defendant of Israel's right to exist with safety and security, and that we need a two-state solution. But in doing that, we can't shy away from calling out human rights violations when they happen. When there's egregious activities of a military against, for example, in this case, Palestinians, we've got to call that out. And we have to find ways to work towards peace. So that's what I believe in. And I believe that requires recognizing the inherent justice and dignity of all people.
Okay, quickly, there was a decision this week in Quebec about the very controversial law that would ban the turban, the Jewish kippah, the Islamic hijab, and the court ruled that it was basically okay to let that law stand, notwithstanding the Charter of Rights, an exception carved out for English schools. Very controversial in the last election. I feel like you kind of pulled your punches on that one. I know you did, in terms of respecting provincial jurisdiction, but you got into politics for federal for human rights. So what do you make of that decision?
Yeah, I'm opposed to it. I think it's wrong, or sorry, the bill is wrong. The decision is complicated because the decision does say some good things, like this breaches human rights, and does say some things that acknowledge the problems with it. But really, I think what this is a story of is Quebecers who championed the rights of people, that fought this in court, and were able to get an acknowledgement that this law is problematic. And I want to salute and acknowledge all the people in Quebec that are fighting for justice and fairness. And I'm going to do my part to continue to say that laws that discriminate people based on the way they look are obviously wrong. Someone who wears a turban, I'm directly impacted by that concept. And I know so many people that want to contribute more and can't because of the way they look in Quebec, and that's wrong. And so we are going to continue to see incredible champions of justice and human rights fight for this. And I'm proud to see that people in Quebec are standing up to it.
All right, we are out of time. We actually into overtime. Mr. Singh and his team, they tried to get the questions for me, but they did give me some extra time. And so I got a better deal out of this because I didn't give them the questions. Jagmeet Singh, I want to thank you for sharing your political and also your personal journey. You're busy saving the world and the country, so we appreciate you reconnecting with Ryerson. You're always welcome. Let's have you back. And thank you also to everyone in the audience who listened in on this conversation and asked some great questions. Before you go, I also want to tip you off, as I already did, to our next Ryerson Democracy Forum. I'll be hosting the leader of Canada's Green Party, Annamie Paul, on May 6th at the same time. So check it out online. Please register and get the Zoom link. Finally, a very special thanks to the Faculty of Arts for hosting today's event, the Dean, Dr. Pam Sugaman, and the Head of Operations, Melissa Wong. Thank you, Mr. Singh. Stay sane, stay safe. See you in 2 weeks, everybody. You can come too, Mr. Singh, at our next event. Bye for now.
Thanks so much. Take care, everybody. Great questions. Honored to be here. Thank you.